Thank you so much for joining the Oceanside Library. And now to introduce our presenters from Cornell Cooperative Extension, Beth and Nicole. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Akaria. Thank you to Oceanside Library, and thank you to the patrons who have joined us today. My name is Nicole. My colleague's name is Beth, as Akaria said. Beth is going to be starting the presentation with all types of gardening tips for, I think, one of the most popular things to grow, or at least in our area. So we're going to be talking about tomatoes. So after Beth is done, I will take over with the nutrition part, all the goodies, the good tips and tricks, as well in the kitchen. So if you have questions, please use the chat feature. After Beth is done, we'll have a little bit of time to answer questions, and then same thing at the end of my part of the presentation. So Beth, all good on your end.
Okay, I am gonna share a screen with you guys. I am hoping I can share the screen. It is not coming up. Anyway, we're going to be talking about tomatoes today. Okari, if you could make sure I can share my screen. It is not coming up on here. Tomatoes are a very large topic.
Sure,
so,
I'm actually going to make it.
I hope we don't have to stop at precisely 3 because Nicole and I both tend to run a little bit, especially me, over because there's a lot to talk about.
No worries. And Beth, it says you have the co-host function, so I don't know why.
Okay, I'm doing under share screen. Oh, there we go, there we go. I got it. Cool. It was just me being stupid, which does happen frequently with technology. I am much better outside in the garden. Okay, and let me start a little slide here. So I'm basically just telling you how to grow tomatoes optimally, rather than, you know, this is the only way that you can grow tomatoes. You can grow tomatoes pretty well, even if you don't know anything. And also there is a Cornell document, which I will share, that tells you pretty much everything that I'm gonna say in this presentation. So don't worry too much if you feel like there's a lot of information. Tomatoes are strong, determined plants. They started out here in the northern part of South America. There's still a bunch of relatives, wild relatives of the tomato growing there. And as with many plants, people started carrying the seeds around and cultivating them for food. And one particular species got taken to Mexico, was cultivated there as long as 4,000 years ago. And that is where the Europeans ran into it in the mid-1500s. They took it back to Europe, where it became popular, particularly in Italy and Spain. And then European settlers brought it back to North America. It wasn't accepted over here, even though it came over in the 1700s with the Europeans, for quite a while, broad scale, because people distrusted it because it looked like a plant that they knew was poisonous. So it didn't really get popular here for about 100 years or so after European settlers popularized it. And that is because it is related to some poisonous plants. It is part of a family of plants called the nightshades: tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, tomatillos, ground cherries, potatoes, tobacco, nightshade, both deadly and bittersweet. They are all related plants. So when people looked at tomato, the early Americans, they said, that looks a lot like bittersweet nightshade, which is the one you see on the far right with tiny little red berries. And as you can see, the flowers are purple, but they're shaped like tomato flowers. And they were quite correct. The plants were related. All of these plants do produce toxic compounds, mostly solanine and tomatine, which Nicole knows more about and can address. But these plants produce these toxins in different amounts. And within each plant, they will produce the toxin in different amounts in different parts. So for instance, all of the nightshade plant is toxic, including the very poisonous berry. In a tomato, the leaves are mildly poisonous. They have that same compound, but in a smaller amount than nightshade, and the tomato fruits have very little. It is what is called a tender perennial. Remember, it comes from right on top of the equator, basically. So it's a perennial plant where it grows. Tender means it can't take frost. We have a lot of plants in our gardens that we treat as annuals, but that are really tender perennials. They just can't take the cold. Tomato is a fruit by botanical terms. It is actually a berry. Legally, and in terms of grocery store parlance and cooking parlance, it is a vegetable. That's how we use it. It was classified as a vegetable in order to collect import taxes on it at a time when vegetables were taxed and fruits were not. One of those weird legal issues that come up for no reason whatsoever. We call tomatoes vines. They're not true vines. They don't pull themselves up with tendrils or rootlets, and they don't twine. They kind of sprawl. They grow up and then they lean over and they lean on the plant next to them, and then they grow up a little more and then they flop over on the plant some more. So they end up kind of draped on top of other plants. There are determinate types of tomatoes that are not quite so floppy. They're a little bushier. And that brings us to some of the terms that confuse people about tomatoes. Indeterminate and determinate refers to how the plant grows and how big it gets. Most tomatoes are indeterminate. They keep growing until something stops them. And that means you can have a tomato vine that gets 8 feet, 10 feet long, depending on what kind you picked. If it's a fast grower, many cherry tomatoes grow very fast. You could end up with a very large plant in your garden. And it's going to keep growing until something stops it. And in our case, that's usually frost, although it is occasionally another problem like disease or drought. As soon as it starts flowering and fruiting, it's going to keep doing that until, again, it's stopped by frost. Again, this is the indeterminate. And because it is so large and sprawly and it keeps growing, you're going to have to support it in your garden. If you don't, you're inviting the chipmunks to share your harvest. Wild tomatoes do grow along the ground, but they are also going to pick up diseases that way, and lots of animals are going to help themselves to the fruit when it's on the ground. A determinate tomato is one that people have bred to be a little shorter and stockier, and they don't just produce fruit and fruit and fruit and fruit the whole season. They usually flower and fruit within a set period of time. So you're going to get most of your harvest within 3 weeks, 2 weeks. A lot of plum type tomatoes are like that, and that's an advantage for when you're cooking. They tend to be shorter because they do have this sort of end point in their lifespan when they stop growing and they finish fruiting. So you don't necessarily have to support a determinate tomato with a stake or a cage. I do anyway because a tomato plant's a little brittle, and if you get wind or it just gets really heavy with fruit, it can break. Other tomato terms that confuse people: hybrid, open pollinated, and heirloom, and this all has to do with genetics, and it's really only relevant if you're going to save seed. If you remember Gregor Mendel's experiments that you learned about in high school, a hybrid is a cross of 2 different varieties. So he was crossing peas, pink and white flowers, wrinkled and smooth peas, etc. And the hybrid is a cross of 2 different varieties in order to get a 3rd different variety. So if it produces seed again, if you remember Mendel, you don't know what the seed is going to resemble, whether it's going to resemble one of the parents, or whether it's going to be like the hybrid, or whether it's going to be something completely different. So you don't save hybrid seeds. Open pollinated means if you save the seeds, you're pretty sure to get the same type of plant. So, you know, Cherokee purple or one of the other famous heirlooms. If you save those seeds and you plant them next year, you're probably going to get that same plant. An heirloom tomato is just an open pollinated type that's been saved for a particular flavor, shape, some other desirable characteristic. But what we're really interested in is what are we going to do with them? So you've got your beefsteaks or slicers. Those are your nice big fat ones for sandwiches or caprese salads. You've got plum tomatoes, which have less water in them, and so they are generally better for sauce. And then you have the little guys who really look like what they are, which is a berry that you just toss into things fresh, although you can also cook them and dry them, as Nicole can tell you. When you're going to put your tomatoes in the garden, you want to think about where you're going to put it and what you're going to have to do to take care of it. And here again at the bottom, everything you want to know about growing tomatoes is in this fact sheet, which I put into the chat box but didn't press return yet. So I will do that when I am done, and you will have that link. Tomatoes are greedy and they are large. They want full sun all day. I am squeezing tomatoes out of a 6-hour sunshine vegetable garden, which is all that I have, but they would really be happier with 8 hours. They want well-drained soil. They're quite spoiled, like most of our annual garden vegetables, with a pH where most garden vegetables like it, between 6 and 7. They want a lot of organic matter. The best thing that I think that you can do for your tomatoes is give them compost or composted manure, and you incorporate that into the soil at the beginning of the season. because then they will have something to feed on throughout the entire season. And again, remember, these guys are going to grow until frost stops them, so you need to make sure you have enough space. As far as what you're going to have to do, you're basically going to have to pay attention. You have to give the tomato the right setup, and you have to be out there making sure things are going well. You don't have to spend an hour on your tomato every time, but you need to be on top of the situation because that plant wants regular water. The regularity of the water is very important. You're going to want to mulch around it. You'll probably have to support it if you didn't put enough compost in, or even if you did and your plant looks a little weak, you might have to fertilize. I do recommend slow release fertilizer. And you can prune it if you want to keep it more manageable. And that basically just means you're training the tomato to only have one main stem, and it will produce the flowers and fruit off of that. And you're taking off all the extras, and it just makes it a little easier for you to manage. It's not a health issue for the tomatoes, really. You're also going to have to think, if you grow tomatoes once and you want to grow them again, where are you going to put them next year? Crop rotation refers to putting the same plant in a different spot each year in order to avoid a buildup of problems. If you grow them in containers, you'll have to clean that container if you're going to grow the same thing in it. And you just have to be out there keeping an eye on what's going on. Raised beds and containers are both really good ways to sort of control the conditions for your tomato. You're guaranteed good drainage, and you'll be able to see, okay, this is the area where I needed to put in nutrition. It just makes it more manageable. I prefer the raised bed because a container dries out a little bit too fast, but both of them. And an in-ground tomato is fine too, but you just need to be watching to make sure they're getting enough water and the proper care. So what kind should you put in? Well, what do you want to eat? That's really the determining factor. If you love making sauce, you get a sauce tomato. If you just want something for your sandwich, you get a beefsteak. And within that, once you've decided what you want to eat the tomato for or in, decide how much trouble you want to take. It is worth sometimes selecting something for disease resistance. Most tomatoes, especially in our area, are prone to a fair number of problems, and getting one that is resistant to disease will mean you spend less time worrying and taking care of it. And if you really just don't want to mess with a really big plant, get a determinate type. So think about its growth habit. About as far as where to get your tomatoes, I do not recommend using the little volunteers that grew from last year's tomato. And there's two reasons for that. One is that they're growing in the spot where you had tomatoes last year, and I just said that's not a good idea, and we'll go into why in a little bit. But the other reason is that any problem that you had on last year's tomato will probably have a head start on this tomato, because tomato diseases overwinter on tomato material, including dropped fruits, which is where this seedling probably came from. There's also, of course, the question of what kind of a tomato is it going to be. If you grew a hybrid, you don't know what kind of tomato it's going to be. So you can get them from garden centers. That's perfectly fine. I would recommend places that have been locally grown. You can get problems with tomatoes that have been imported from other states and are sold usually at big box stores. Sometimes they import diseases, and they're not necessarily adapted for our climate. My favorite place to buy tomato plants is farmers markets, because sometimes the farmers who sell things there have certain types that they think are delicious, or that sell well, or that grow well for them, and so they'll have those starts. So that's a kind of a good recommendation if someone at a farmer's market has that seedling for sale. But my very favorite way is to grow them from seed myself indoors. Tomatoes are eager to grow, and it's really not difficult, but there are three things you have to consider. The first is timing. You have to plant the seeds at the right time. It is not worth planting a tomato from seed outdoors because it's not going to start to grow until the weather is warm, and by that time, it's very late to start a tomato plant, and you wouldn't get any fruit from it until the end of September. So you're going to plant that seed 6 to 8 weeks before you put it outside, which means at the end of March or the beginning of April. And now if you're doing the math in your head, you're saying, well, that means I'm not putting the plant outside until late May or early June. And that's right. You should put the plants out late, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But starting that seed inside, it needs very bright light, and it needs to be warm. So some people have grown tomato seedlings with success on their windowsill I don't recommend it both from the light perspective and from the warmth perspective, because in March and April, that window is going to be cold. And the sunlight coming through that window really isn't that strong. And you want to start your tomato seedlings nice and strong and sturdy and not kind of thin and spindly the way they may look in a window. You can buy a plant light that looks like this little desk lampy thing on the left for around 40 bucks maybe. I have a set of light shelves like this one in the middle. That's very expensive. It's several $100s. I have more than gotten my money's worth out of it because I raise hundreds of seedlings on it every year. But unless you really love seed starting, if you only want to start 3 tomato plants, all you need is a little desk lamp and you can put it anywhere in your house and grow your 3 tomato plants there. So again, those plants shouldn't go out until late May. And I know every garden center on Long Island sells all their half their tomato plants on Mother's Day, and people go out and plant them immediately afterwards. But we have lately had very cool springs, and they've lasted a long time. And it has been not unusual to have very chilly nighttime temperatures throughout a lot of May. You need to wait until nighttime temperatures are always above 45. Don't worry if you feel like you're putting your stuff out later than everybody else. Your tomatoes will catch up as soon as the warm weather comes. Your neighbor's tomatoes that they put out early will be held back by and weakened by the cold weather. So don't worry about starting later than other people. Wait until the weather's right for your plant. Prepare your site properly. So you can put in compost. Again, that is my favorite way to nourish the plants. That is drip irrigation in the second picture. If you're going to put in an irrigation system, I recommend you do this and not an overhead sprinkler, because watering tomato leaves all the time really increases your disease problems. When you put your plants out, you don't put them out right away. Keep them on your porch, your patio, your front step in kind of a sheltered spot for a couple of days. And if it's really cold at night, you bring them back in so they don't have to suffer through that right away. That's called hardening off. And if whether your plant was grown in your house or it's been sitting in a nice cushy greenhouse somewhere, it needs to get used to the outdoors before you put it in the ground. And when you do put it in, tomato is one of the only plants that you put in deeply, more deeply than it was sitting in the pot. And the reason is it will grow roots along any part of the stem that touches the ground. And the more roots it has, the more nutrients it can take in and the stronger it's going to be as a plant. So when it comes to tomato care, these are really the 2 words you need to remember: prevention and attention. Those are both very, very important, and that's really everything when it comes to tomatoes. Those plants are going to want regular water, and they do want a fair amount of water, but it needs to be regular. You need to mulch to keep the weeds down. Those weeds will compete with the tomato for the water, the nutrients, and the light, and they can also help pass around diseases. You'll want to support your plant so that it doesn't break. It doesn't trail on the ground and pick up all the disease organisms in the soil. If you did not put in enough compost, or even if you did, but your plant looks a little weak, you may have to fertilize it. Again, if you want to keep it in bounds, make it a little more manageable, you might have to prune it. And the pruning is one of these middle pictures here. You can see there's a little shoot coming out from the crotch where the leaf comes off of the main stem. You just pinch those off, and then you have one single main stem, and the plant is much, much more manageable that way. It can also enhance the air circulation around your plant, which is very important for reducing disease. And you just need to be out there. Be out there checking on the plant just for a few minutes, but every day, every couple of days, keep an eye on it, because things do progress rather quickly with tomatoes once the weather gets warm. Tomatoes are prone to a lot of problems. Diseases are the really big one. There are also some pests, and there are a few other problems that a lot of people think are diseases, but that aren't. So on the top row, we have 3 different diseases. On the second row, we have some pests, which you can recognize because they're little animals on your plant. And on the bottom, there are problems that are neither one. So the distorted tomatoes, way on the left, that's called cat facing, and it's caused by insufficient pollination or irregular weather. Sometimes a combination of both. But it's not a disease, and it's not a pest that's doing that. The cracking in the tomato is usually, again, due to irregular watering. So the plant didn't get a lot of water, and then all of a sudden it got a whole bunch of water, and that caused it to crack. You can have herbicide injury. If you're spraying herbicides on your lawn and it's right next to the tomato garden, that stuff can drift. So you want to be very, very careful with that around plants. And that last picture with a big black spot on the bottom of tomatoes, that's a very common problem. It is not a fungal disease. This is called blossom end rot, and it means the tomato has not been able to access enough calcium. Now there may be enough calcium in there, but if the plant, again, is not getting regular water, the plant can't access it. I had a bunch of this on my plum tomatoes this summer, and I added some bone meal and made sure that I repaired my watering schedule to make sure those plants got sufficient water. And it cleared up. But when you're curing or trying to solve a tomato problem, you should be using IPM. That stands for Integrated Pest Management. But really what it stands for is using your head. Common sense and some thinking. So you have to observe what went on. Did we have a drought and then a rain? Was there just a frost? What time of year is it? And then you have to correctly identify what the problem is. Again, if you take that blossom end rot, which is a calcium deficiency, and you spray fungicide on it, you're not doing anything but wasting your fungicide. So you have to know what the problem is. And it's very easy. You Google images, tomato leaf problems or tomato fruit problems. You find a picture that matches, and then you're going to be able to look it up and see what the problem was. And when you are addressing the problem, you use any or all appropriate measures from the least harmful to the most harmful. So the first thing you're looking at is what your cultural practices are, and that was the prevention part. Did you set it up properly? How are you taking care of your tomato? Is it mulched? Is it regularly watered? Does it have enough space between plants? Air movement is very important when it comes to preventing diseases. So that's the first thing. Then you think about mechanical control. Mechanical means you do something physical. You pick off diseased leaves to slow down the disease. You pull off caterpillars and dump them in soapy water so that they drown with your hands. Very simple. You're not putting any chemicals or pollutants into the environment. Then you think about the biological controls. Can I bring in predatory insects to help in my garden? And when everything else has failed, and only then, you can look at your chemical options. And if you're using any kind of chemical, fungicide, insecticide, you read the label and you use it according to the label because that is the law. When your tomatoes are all done for the season, they're winding down, they're getting ugly, it's getting cold, clean up your garden. Remove all the debris. If there was any sign of any disease, I would put all that tomato debris in the garbage. I almost never put tomatoes in the compost because they almost always have some kind of a problem by the end of the season. And I don't want that to come back in my compost the next year. And I want to protect my soil for whatever I put in the next year. So, and I will do that with either mulch or a cover crop, which is a plant basically that you put down to protect and improve your soil. And then you cut it down later. It's not a plant that you grow for food. And if you grew your tomato in a container, make sure you clean it. And I don't mean you rinse it, I mean you clean it. I use boiling water. You can also use a bleach-based spray, or you can use rubbing alcohol. But if you're gonna put tomatoes in it again, it needs to be cleaned. And if you had your tomato in the ground, you need to think about crop rotation. And a safe practice is to say, I'm only gonna put tomatoes in this particular spot every 4 years. So this year the tomato goes here, next year it goes in area B, next year it goes in area C, then area D, then it comes back here to area A. And you have to plan that to make sure that you don't put it in the same spot, because any disease of your tomato will survive on any debris that's left in the soil. You want to make sure there's none left. Even if you're careful in your cleanup, there may be something in your soil, so don't plant it in the same place over and over. It also uses up the same nutrients every time, so you get nutrient imbalances if you grow the same crop in the same spot. Other than that, we need to think about how we're going to eat the tomatoes when they are ready. And Nicole can tell you about that.
Thanks, Beth. Does anybody have any questions about Beth's part of the presentation? I know it's a lot of information. I don't do all of the things that Beth says to do, but maybe I will put them into practice a little bit more.
Again, this is all about optimally growing them, and all the information is in that link.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
take a
So
look
I
at
put
that.
the link in the chat. The fact sheets are incredibly useful. So you can explore the CCE website a little bit more and find other fact sheets for other, your favorite fruits and veggies that you grow. So if there aren't any questions, I will share my screen and start with my part of the presentation. So again, my name is Nicole. I'm one of the community nutrition educators here at CCE Nassau. And we as a society love tomatoes. Tomatoes and tomato products are one of the most familiar and popular products in the American diet. They're actually the most consumed non-starchy vegetable, even though we learned from Beth that it is botanically a fruit. Interesting how, the government gets involved with, defining fruits and vegetables, but it is what it is, right? So tomatoes have a super unique ability to meet a lot of our demands when it comes to a food product. So cost-wise, convenience, availability, their taste, of course, their healthfulness, and also their ability to be used in many culturally diverse cuisines, which we love. So tomatoes sort of hit the mark on many of these factors that we're looking for. So tomatoes are naturally rich in potassium, which is something that's sometimes people are surprised to find out because we think potassium, we think bananas, but things like avocados, tomatoes also have a lot of potassium. They rank 7th out of a list of things like milk, potatoes, beef, coffee, orange and grapefruit juice as one of our top sources of potassium. Potassium is a nutrient of concern, so that's why it's particularly interesting for us to take note of the amount of potassium in tomatoes, which means that Americans typically don't consume the daily recommended amounts. So potassium is a mineral that can help to reduce blood pressure, reduce the effects of consuming excess sodium in our diets, reduce the risk of kidney stones, possibly reduce the risk of age-related bone loss. It's important in bone health. So it's something that we definitely want to try and get enough of. Vitamin C as well. So pretty much like any fruit or vegetable is going to have a good amount of vitamin C. Vitamin A. So vitamin A is one of our fat-soluble vitamins, and tomato products contain beta-carotene, which is a precursor for vitamin A. So vitamin A has antioxidant properties that we see has the potential to fight free radicals. And beta-carotene in particular is also known as being important for vision. Fiber, of course, again, fruits and vegetables, we're gonna see that fiber in there. And we could talk all day about fiber, but we see a lot of different health benefits of fiber, including improving our bowel transit, right? Keeping things regular, helping to reduce our cholesterol, and also helping to manage that blood sugar concentration. So fiber helps to prevent those immediate spikes when we consume a carbohydrate-rich meal or snack. Lycopene in particular, so I have a whole slide on lycopene, so I'll hold off on getting into that. And I did want to put a little bit of information in here about nightshades. So Beth mentioned that we see certain nightshades, the nightshade family, and we see things like solanine. So solanine is a type of alkaloid. And people seem to associate nightshades in general with inflammation or the inflammatory response in the body. And it, of course, is true that these alkaloids are dangerous in large doses, right? The dose makes the poison, like anything. But when you compare, say, a tomato to something like tobacco, which we know is harmful to humans, you take it with a grain of salt, right? So there's not a ton of research that suggests that we should be avoiding nightshades as a potential treatment for any sort of inflammatory condition. If you specifically feel like when you consume nightshades that you have either worsening symptoms or it's causing something in you, I would say speak to a dietitian, speak to a physician, because he or she could guide you through some sort of elimination just to see if you could pinpoint what the culprit is, because each one of us is different. Each one of us is going to have a totally different response to foods. So you and I could eat the same thing and I could have a reaction and you don't, and vice versa. So you may be sensitive to things that I'm not. So lycopene, tomatoes are rich in this particular powerful antioxidant group called carotenoids. So we mentioned beta carotene earlier, which again, we see the ability to inactivate free radicals, protect against cancer, slow the development of atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of plaque in our arteries. And the most plentiful carotenoid is lycopene. So that gives those reddish, pinkish fruits and veggies, watermelon, tomatoes, grapefruit, that beautiful color. So typically when you see different colored fruits and vegetables, they have a higher concentration of a certain compound. So in this case, it's lycopene. So about 80% of the lycopene in our diet, in the American diet, comes from tomatoes and tomato products. And the reason I keep throwing tomato products out there is because when tomatoes are cooked, as they are in processed tomatoes, tomato puree, tomato sauce, other canned tomato products, the lycopene is even more available to us. So cooking opens up the cell wall and allows that lycopene to be better absorbed once we eat it. So there's potential there for even more protection and those anti-inflammatory benefits that we talked about. So there's no daily recommendation for lycopene like there is for vitamin D or potassium or something like that. But we have some studies that show anywhere between 9 and 21 milligrams per day is most beneficial, which you can see here on this chart is super easy to get to with, one serving, less than one serving of some sort of tomato or tomato product. So whether that's, half a cup of tomato sauce here or there, maybe you're making chili and you put, canned diced tomatoes or whatever it is, you're having a caprese salad. So you can see here that it's pretty simple to get to that number if you're consuming tomatoes. So especially consider eating your tomatoes with a little bit of a healthy fat. So whether that's olive oil drizzled on your caprese salad, whether you're having some sort of guacamole, with your salsa, right? So those healthy fats and avocado, because the fat can also help to increase the amount of lycopene we can absorb. So the reason that we spend so much time on lycopene is because the research that we have suggests that lycopene can be a big factor behind these general, health benefits of tomato products. And research suggests that diets that are high in lycopene from foods like tomatoes can help decrease the risk of certain cancers, particularly prostate, lung, and stomach cancers. But I do want to say that a lot of these studies that I'm referencing in the area of tomato consumption and lycopene tend to be observational. So again, sometimes we don't have that concrete evidence to say this many people consumed this and this is what happened, but we have some sort of correlation. We're seeing a connection between this sort of intake and these benefits. And if you like tomatoes, that's good news for me. All right, so as far as storage and preparation, we want to keep tomatoes at room temperature, which a lot of people I think are surprised. I think most people put it in the fridge, at least that's my experience, away from sunlight, of course. If they're overripe or if you don't plan on using them right away, yes, then you can refrigerate it to get the length out of it, but that sort of cold temperature can destroy some of the flavor. It also changes the texture. If you've ever noticed keeping a tomato in the fridge, it gets a little mealy almost. And if you do want to ripen it a little quicker, you can put it in a paper bag. Don't wash tomatoes until you are ready to eat them, similar to berries, right? When we get them wet, they sort of, and they're sitting together, we can sort of encourage spoilage. And especially if they're bruised, they're very sensitive, very, soft hearts. So you want to try and keep them from being bruised if you can. And of course, tomatoes can be enjoyed, many, many, many different ways. They're really versatile. The flavor can be developed depending on how you cook them or what you do with it. And like Beth said, what you do to them or the treatment may depend on the type of tomato. So the sauce, the plum tomatoes, the Roma tomatoes, the reason they're good for sauce, I think Beth mentioned it because they have a lower water content. But you can really do almost anything, right? We can eat them raw. We could do some sort of bruschetta with some olive oil and fresh basil or oregano, a little bit of olive oil on a crostini or something like that, in a fresh salsa, grilled. I know I like to put the little ones on a skewer when I'm doing kebabs, roasted. So you can get a really sweet but complex flavor when we roast, right? Same thing with garlic. You put garlic in the oven and all of a sudden it takes on a whole different life of its own. Sauteed, of course, stewed in chilies or sauces or something like that. So really it depends on your preference. It depends on the amount of tomatoes you have, right? If you have a whole bunch of tomatoes, what am I going to do with it? There's only so much, bruschetta I can have. But I did want to also touch on when fresh isn't best, which of course we're in the peak of Long Island tomato growing season. So I'm sure most of us would prefer fresh when we can get it, especially locally grown. Locally grown, whether it's from your CSA, which is community supported agriculture, I could talk about that a little bit later, or from the farmer's market or from your own garden, right? They are fresher. They have such a different, better taste than tomatoes you get either in the middle of January or that are coming from South America or Mexico. And choosing local products also help our farmers, of course. So out of season processed tomato products can be a more suitable, sustainable, and affordable choice than fresh. Because, you think about the fresh tomato crop when it's out of season, it's typically picked potentially weeks before it's actually ripe in order to withstand transportation, which means there's more energy that's needed for it to get to us. It needs to be potentially refrigerated over thousands of miles, how many days, to get to you. And so in many instances, those fresh tomatoes that are grown elsewhere are coming in maybe heat or like not optimal temperatures, heat, and we know things like vitamin C, B vitamins can be degraded by things like heat, things like time, and exposure to light. So when we have to travel, when the tomatoes have to travel over a long distance, we're exposing them to a lot of things. And so there's a lot of different reasons that they don't taste as good, right? They don't look as good. And although we consider, fresh, raw fruits and vegetables more superior than the processed, the canned or frozen counterparts, we want to think about something like lycopene. So there's a reason that it's a completely valuable addition to our diets. And the reason is because it's giving us even more of that powerful lycopene when something is heated and processed in the way that tomato products typically are. So we're increasing that bioavailability. It is, it's convenient. We have less waste when we're buying, something that can be stored at room temperature, not indefinitely, but over a long period of time. So again, we're preventing food waste instead of buying something that's out of season, maybe it doesn't taste good, so you don't eat it. So we may not use the canned product in the same way that we would use fresh. You can, but a canned tomato product in like a caprese salad, I can't necessarily say if that would be great, as good as fresh. But as far as soup, even salsas, baked dishes, sauce, chilies, absolutely. And there are so many different types of tomato products, tomato paste, tomato sauce, tomato puree, diced tomatoes. But I will say that I find whole peeled and or diced to be what I use a lot, because I think the whole peeled is very versatile and the diced is really convenient. So I could throw diced into my chili, even if I'm making nachos real quick. And especially, once tomato season on Long Island is done. But I will say to check the label because ingredients can vary from brand to brand. And I know some Italians that will not have any tomato product that has any added basil or oregano because they're purists, right? So everybody's got a different taste. But if you're looking for something in particular, just check that label. Any questions so far? Okay, so we could spend days, weeks, a very long time on food preservation, and the plan was to do a Master Food Preserver course this year, which we could not do because of COVID, but I did want to touch on preservation techniques because I think people have a lot of questions about it, and I will try and get through some of the main ones. So freezing tomatoes, of course, is a great way to preserve that freshness. Everybody pretty much has a freezer, right? They will have sort of a mushy texture when they're thawed, and they're good for cooking. Again, I wouldn't necessarily put a pre-frozen, tomato and slice it up for caprese. I wouldn't necessarily make it into bruschetta, but soups, all that kind of stuff. Great. But I would blanch it first. So blanching tomatoes, what you want to do is wash it, dip it in boiling water. Actually, typically you score that bottom with an X for about 30 seconds to loosen those skins. You take the peel off, you take the core out, and you can freeze them whole or freeze them in pieces. I put a link to the National Center for Home Preservation, Food Preservation here. I did not copy and paste it like Beth said she did for hers. But there is a ton of information, whether it's freezing, dehydrating, canning, pickling, because every fruit and vegetable is different. So it has an enormous amount of information on food preservation. So I would check that out if you were interested in more information. As far as dehydrating, the most ideal way to dehydrate would be using a dehydrator, which not all of us have the time, money, all that. It is possible to dehydrate in your oven at the lowest setting. So that's typically 140 to 150 degrees. Some ovens don't get that low, number one. Number two, sometimes you got to leave your oven slightly ajar. And today's a beautiful day, but in the middle of summer, you don't necessarily want to do that. May take hours to do, and it takes up a lot of energy. So dehydrating may not be the best preservation technique if they're delicious, right? As far as sun drying, I know people have been successful with sun drying. Of course, you'd have to make sure that you have days, right, typically of nice weather, and also keep the buggies away. Canning. So when tomatoes are canned, what it suggests, and same thing with canning any product, means that it's heated hot enough and long enough to destroy microorganisms that can make people sick, in addition to spoilage. And what we're typically looking at is the Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism, right? So traditionally, we think of tomatoes as being a higher acid fruit or vegetable. But because of the different heirloom varieties, because of all kinds of stuff over the years, not all tomatoes and tomato products fit into that acid category. So for that reason, it's typically recommended to do pressure canning for a lot of tomato products. Some you can get away with boiling water canning. But other methods like open kettle canning, oven canning, I know some pretty old school people that make tomato sauce and their grandma, flips the can over or the jar, and then they think it's sealed. I'm going to say that the USDA doesn't approve of this. It can be hazardous, right? You like knock on wood and hope for the best. That's not what we want to do here. So I only follow, USDA approved recipes. And again, we can really spend a lot of time on this. But if you're looking to can for long-term storage, you really have to follow those rules. It's a food safety and a health risk otherwise. As far as pickling, the safety concerns that I mentioned for canning are the same as far as pickling for long-term storage, but you can absolutely do a quick pickle or refrigerator pickle. So I do this with a lot of, why do I keep clicking? So I'm trying to move my little people. So you can do this with almost any vegetable. They're especially good for things like radishes, cucumbers. You could do green beans. You could do a lot of different things. I think the little cherry or grape tomatoes would be great, or you can cut up bigger tomatoes. And the ratio is going to depend on what you like. So usually I do like equal parts water and vinegar. So whether it's white vinegar, sometimes apple cider vinegar, rice wine vinegar. I wouldn't do balsamic. And then a little bit of salt, a little bit of sugar, and then whatever add-in you like. So whether it's whole garlic cloves or peppercorns or red pepper flakes. So what I would do is I would warm the vinegar and the water together with that salt and sugar just to make sure everything dissolves. And then I would put everything in my jar and I would cover it to the top, like to make sure everything in my jar is covered. And you put it in the fridge. And the longer you leave it, the more potent the flavors are going to be. But you can experiment with it and see what you like. Again, not long-term storage. This is not safe for your, pantry or anything like that. But it's a really good way to use some of that produce in a new way if you are, curious about it. Okay. Culinary uses, of course, tomatoes are, I can't think of a cuisine that they're not in. Maybe like Inuit, if you're in Alaska or like the, super far north or south poles, but we see tomatoes everywhere, whether it's French cuisine and ratatouille, Indian, a lot of those like curries or a tomato dal, which has lentils. and tomato. American, of course, when you think of chili or, grilled cheese with tomato soup. Mediterranean, whether it's bruschetta, caprese salad, shakshuka, which I think, every time I do this, I think this image is of either shakshuka or tomatoes in purgatory. So shakshuka is a Middle Eastern Israeli dish. It's a really delicious brunch dish, but it's typically like a tomato and pepper stew type situation that you poach eggs directly in. And eggs in purgatory is, I believe, Italian, and which makes me think there's tomato and basil there, so maybe it's that. But it's really interesting if you want to explore that. And of course, Latin American, who could forget, huevos rancheros, chilaquiles, pico de gallo. I mean, we could go on and on and on. So today I wanted to keep it super simple. So we start with a simple red salsa, and then I'm not going to make the second part of it, which makes this into chilaquiles, but I'm going to talk about it. So this is a recipe that I adapted from a Latina RD. She's in Arizona. So again, you want to keep it simple because a lot of the times the taste of the tomato doesn't need much, right? I mean, you can make a fresh salsa. You can, just put a little salt on that piece of, tomato and eat it like that. But sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of, something special. And I think what makes it a little special is that I broiled these ingredients. So I have my tomatoes. I have a few cloves of garlic. I did 1 small onion, but you can stick with half. And I have 2 jalapenos. If you like it a little spicier, you can even go to 3. I think I did 3 last time. Again, it depends. So you can stop here, or you can continue and make the salsa chilaquiles. So I can share this recipe with Ocaria. My kitchen is very small. Otherwise, we could do a whole demo in my kitchen. But essentially what you would do is take the salsa I'm about to make for you and heat it over the stove with a little bit of spices. So the spices you see here. Typically it's Mexican oregano if you can find it. It has a slightly different taste than the traditional oregano we probably have in our cabinets. Cumin, chili powder, a little bit of broth, whether it's chicken broth or vegetable broth. And then so unlike shakshuka, you do not cook the eggs directly in this sauce mixture that you're cooking. You would typically either scramble, or if you want it over easy or something like that, and then just serve it on top. So toward the end of the cooking process of that sauce, you would put some either store-bought or homemade, tortilla chips or something, so that can coat those tortilla chips in the sauce like you see in this picture here, and serve it with the eggs on top and what other fixings you like. I wish that I could make this whole thing for you, but I'm just gonna stick with the salsa. Again, we've kept it simple, 4 ingredients, a little bit of salt if you're interested, and you can get away with so little because the freshness of the products that we're using. So I'll show you what's in front of me, and then I'm gonna run to wash my hands. So again, we have, and I stuck with some tomatoes on the smaller side just because I'm using my little bitty baby food processor here. But we have a few jalapenos, we have a full onion, because it's a little guy, a few cloves of garlic, and I have some salt. And that's gonna be it. So I'm gonna go run and wash my hands, and I will be right back.
I love when Nicole does these programs right before lunch. We've had a couple like that, and I've gone ravenous into my kitchen.
Beth, you took the word right out of my mouth, because I was going to say just that. This is making me so hungry. I'm ready for dinner already.
I can't wait till we can do in-person programming. And
Me too. I used to love when Nicole came in for in-person programs because you'd always get a treat out of it. And don't worry, patrons, we will see that day again.
I know. So that's, I was going to say, when I am in person, I typically, everybody tastes everything. So I'm just taking the top off of the jalapeno. If you want, you can remove some of the seeds because this one really doesn't have a lot of seeds and I like it spicy. But if you don't want spicy, you could either leave the jalapenos out totally or scrape out some of the inside. I'm going to put the whole thing in because I like it spicy. And again, I'm using a teeny tiny food processor. It gets the job done and it's perfect for everyday use. Like I could do hummus in here, I do pesto, whatever it is. And then I bring out the big guns when I need to. So I broiled everything for about 10 minutes on high. So it sort of depends on your oven because 10 minutes might be too much for you. So maybe start with 7 or 8. And you can see that everything softened a little bit. It got a beautiful color to it. And again, you can change the ratio if you like things less more garlicky, less more, you know, spicy. You can also use the little tomatoes. If you have a ton of cherry tomatoes, the only thing I would suggest is not broiling it for that long. So maybe start with the onions and the garlic and the jalapenos, and maybe you throw in your cherry tomatoes for the last few minutes because they will take no time at all to blister. I might start with my little tomatoes, and then once it's processed, add my big one in because I don't have a lot of room. I left the paper on, as you could tell, the garlic and the onion, just to make things easier. And this way the outside doesn't, you know, char too quickly. It's a nice reminder to wash your hands when you're handling food, right? You're gonna be all up in that onion. I typically like red onion when I'm using them raw, and then I like either yellow or sweet onions. Again, it could be a preference, or whatever you have on hand. Okay. And I brought my little bowl and I forgot to use it. That makes things convenient. Just have a little mess bowl. So I'm gonna mute myself so you don't hear my processor, and then I'll be right back.
Nicole calls that her tiny processor, but that's the shape of the one I have that fits on my blender. So that may be, I don't know, maybe I'm different, but some people don't have a huge food processor. So it's nice.
I have that one too. I have the same one Nicole has. I use it so often. Food processors are the best.
I call it teeny tiny because my sister got me a monster one for a holiday that I honestly never use. I feel terrible, but it's too big to really keep on hand. So I definitely use this one more. So as you can see, I'm just adding the rest of my tomato. I'm gonna add just a teeny bit of salt. You don't really have to add any salt if you don't want to. You can add other flavors or keep it simple. I like to keep things simple sometimes. The roasting, the broiling helps to bring out the flavors without needing to sort of sit, you know, over a stove if you're trying to create, you know, complex flavors. So it gives it a little bit of depth without needing, the oven's not on too long, the stove isn't on, you're not standing and stirring. So
She even takes it politely off the table so it doesn't vibrate the computer.
Good observation. That's so funny.
So I mean, every time I do this, I wish you could smell it. It smells so good. It smells so fresh. You don't get, it's not too spicy. Like sometimes when you put too much spice in there, it hits you. It's really, I mean, it looks pretty professional considering how easy it was to make. The only thing that I could see maybe making it better would be maybe some fresh cilantro if you like cilantro. Even parsley if you just want some kind of fresh depth. And look how much salsa that made. Considering there were 3 on the smaller side tomatoes. So you could make a smaller batch, you can make a bigger batch. And like I said, now what you would do is put this in a pan with some broth, those spices, and you could take this to chilaquiles pretty easily. And it's a really impressive dish. I know we aren't really having parties or, you know, brunch, you know, dates or anything like that, but if and when we are, I think chilaquiles, when you order them at a restaurant, seem really complicated, but it's pretty simple. I mean, it's one of my favorite things to order for brunch, and I didn't realize how simple it was. So that's it from me. If anybody has questions, again, I can share that recipe with you, Okaria, if you wanted to send it to whoever's here today.
That would be great, Nicole. Here, let me stop the recording here so that if anyone wants to turn their mics on, they can. Thank you.
Yeah.